In today's gospel, we hear that phrase that Deacon Greg just proclaimed, that a prophet is not without honor except in his native place and among his own kin and in his own house. And yet, despite that, God is still at work. God sends Ezekiel in the first reading to the rebellious house of Israel. He sends Jesus to his native place, although Jesus was unable to perform any mighty deeds there. In 2006, I was appointed as pastor for the first time at St. Lawrence, and St. Lawrence was close to where I grew up. So I grew up along Dixie Highway, and it wasn't my home parish, but it was close to my home parish. And when I arrived there, I realized that 5 members of the parish were actually high school classmates that were in my graduating class, including my prom date. And people had warned me about going home and becoming pastor of the place where you were raised. And so there was a worry and a concern, but my experience there was very, very different, right? It was not that I was rejected, but that I was embraced and accepted. And so, what was the difference between Jesus and me? Don't answer. The list is too long. But it's not the right question, right? The right question is, what was the difference between Jesus' hearers in the synagogue and the good people of St. Lawrence? And part of that answer comes from the end of the gospel reading, where Jesus was amazed at their lack of faith. And the people of St. Lawrence had been a people of faith who'd passed on the faith from generation to generation, who had built really a relationship of trust and belief in God, and that the Spirit had enlivened that community. And so God was already in them. They were already responding to God's work in that community. In fact, they'd done that over a number of different pastors through the years. And one of those pastors, they emblazoned some of his words on a bronze plaque, and they put it on the wall even. Now, that pastor was Father Bob Osborne, our own senior associate, who, by the way, is living at Nazareth Home still, so he's doing well. He did sell his car about four weeks ago or so, and so he's not driving anymore, but he still says Mass at Nazareth Home, and he's getting along. He turned 96 this year and celebrated his 70th year of priesthood. So they put his words on the wall. Share the common vision of a family called and formed by God. And so that seed planted in them, they'd responded to in faith. And so when I arrived, they welcomed me as a brother, right? They really received me into their family. God doesn't work in our lives by forcing us to obey. He doesn't force us to receive Him. He doesn't demand that we follow Him. He invites us into relationship with Him. And so the difference is not in Jesus or in God's work, but it's in our free choice to respond to what God is doing. The church tells us that the preeminent place of that invitation to relationship with God is the Eucharist. Then when we come here, we are invited into that communion with God, into the relationship of trust with Him. And there's lots of ways to foster that faith and that trust in God. In fact, one of those is in Louisville right now. You may be aware that later in July in Indianapolis, there's the National Eucharistic Congress that's happening. And so there have been 4 pilgrimage routes of the Blessed Sacrament moving throughout the United States that are going to converge on July 17th in Indianapolis. The southern route, which is the Juan Diego route, is currently in the Archdiocese of Louisville. So the Blessed Sacrament is traversing our archdiocese, and tomorrow and Tuesday it'll be in the city of Louisville, starting at St. Gabriel, making a number of stops and events, St. Augustine, and then it ends at the 4th Street Bridge, or the Big Four Bridge, for the Archbishop Shelton to cross with the Blessed Sacrament and Archbishop Thompson to receive it from the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. So I encourage you, if you have the opportunity to take part in one of those events, to do so. There is information on our website about that. But this is the invitation each week, here in the Eucharist, in the Mass that we celebrate together, to enter into that relationship of communion with God. And the church tells us that when we do that, when we enter into that participation, that it is to be full, conscious, and active participation. So part of that is our gestures, it's our responses, it's how we sing, it's us trying to pay attention and do those kinds of things. But it's more than just the physical, right? It is our mind and our hearts as well. And I think that the key to that full, active, and conscious participation in the liturgy is something that I'll call presence. I'll say it's our presence, it's our physical presence, it's our psychological presence, and it's our spiritual presence. Our physical presence. Thank you all so much for being here. A friend of mine who was a pastor used to always say, it's a miracle that anybody comes to church. And it is. It is a gift. It is a response of your faith to God's grace to draw you in, to respond to that. So it is a miracle that anybody is here at all. And so our response to that is not to be judgmental of those who aren't here, but to be grateful for those who are here, that who are giving of themselves as a gift to the rest of us and to God. So that is a great gift. But in our modern culture and society and in the busyness and the demands of modern life, it's so hard to try to make that commitment to be here every week. It's hard to do that. It's a difficult thing for us to be able to do. And even in my life, when there were times when I struggled to come to Mass, there were times when really two things kind of hit me. One was apathy, right? Like it doesn't really matter anyway. And the other one was being a little too self-referential. Like, oh, I've got better things to do with my time. And so we need to kind of always move beyond that self-reference and realize that it's not about just what we get out of the Mass, but what we contribute to the Mass for the good of others and to God, right? And so it is hard to make that commitment. I had a great example of one way to do that with my mom when I was growing up, who had just kind of was a default. She had decided it long ago, and so it just became the way that we were as a family. We didn't decide every week whether we were going to go or not. We just always went. It was part of who we were. Many of you know that every morning before Mass, I make my bed. And I started that when I was struggling in seminary, and I was talking to a priest who said that an older priest, when he was in seminary, told him, are you all following? Told him that a sure way to know you have a vocation to the priesthood is if you make your bed every morning before Mass. Now that's not really true. It's kind of a stupid little thing, right? But I haven't missed, or in all transparency, I've missed a handful of times in 20 years. But I do it every day, and it's just what I do now. It was a decision that I made, and it's just what I do. So do I wake up late sometimes, and am I running late for events or other things? Yes, and I make my bed. Do I have busy mornings that are full of all kinds of stressful things? Yes, and I make my bed. Do I sometimes sleep in a little bit on my days off? Yes, and I make my bed, right? It's just part of who I am. The second thing is psychological presence. And on a superficial level, we can think about that when we come to Mass, about the many distractions we may have, the other demands on our lives, the other ways that we have a difficult time paying attention or engaged in what's going on. But deeper, many of us are pretty distant from ourselves. We have a hard time accepting, knowing, and loving ourselves. And so when we come here, we're called to really that deeper place of being psychologically present as who we really are, not as what the image of who we are is that we present. In my own life, the struggle with that has always been shame. It's the shame and the fear that if people really knew who I was, they wouldn't love me or they would reject me. And so we have to realize by God's grace, He made you. He knows you. He loves you. You are who God made you to be, and we don't need to put on masks or put any phoniness on when we come here. We need to come as who we really are, to be fully psychologically present, knowing all of our strengths and weaknesses, knowing all of our gifts and all of our challenges, knowing who we are, because it is hard for us to be present to God if we're not present to ourselves. The third thing is that presence, or the spiritual presence, right? And that's not really about God's presence to us, because God is always present to us. He came to be with his people. He dwells among his people. He comes to be with us. He is close to every one of us. He dwells within every one of us. One author put it this way. They said, God is not closer to us at church, closer to us at church than at a bar. But we may be closer to God at church than at a bar. Right? Our spiritual presence is about coming close to the God who's already close to us. It's about our openness to that presence and the gift of God that he gives to each of us. And so our spiritual presence here is that openness and that willingness to receive what God gives, his love, his mercy, his forgiveness. As we come here, I think that's the key, the physical presence, the psychological presence, and the spiritual presence of how we fully, consciously, and actively participate in the liturgy. That's not easy. It's not easy. It is hard to do and hard to make that commitment and be present in those ways. And that's where the second reading comes in. Paul, who you recognize had received a thorn in the flesh, and he'd asked God not to take it from him, and God's response to him was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." And so Paul starts to boast in his weakness. Even in another place he says, I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do. That he recognizes, and all of us recognize, the need to surrender. That we need God's help. To be fully present, we offer ourselves completely to God in our weakness, because God is the one who is powerful. As St. Paul says, "For when I am weak, then I am strong."